Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Excuse me. Um, so I have been in Alaska now just for the last few days. I live down in the San Juan Islands and Orcas Island. I'm sure you all know where the San Juan Islands are. Just they're sandwiched between the mainland and Vancouver Island, just south of the Canadian border. And I've lived down there for 25 years now with my wife and my 17-year-old son. And this book came out in February, Tides, the Science and Spirit of the Ocean. And since then, I've been actually on the road more than I've been home. And my publicist promptly set up over 100 talks around the country, mostly, of course, on the West Coast and the East Coast. And because I do actually have a life at home, I couldn't be gone for a long stretch of time. So the way this thing was structured was I would be away for 3 to 5 days, and then I would jump back home again and then out again. So it wasn't as efficient as it could have been. So I ended up jumping back and forth, for example, to New England probably 10 times now in the last, since February, and down the coast in California and Oregon almost as many times. This is my first time on this tour to be up in Alaska. So I was in Ketchikan and Sitka, Juneau, Anchorage, here, and then back to Anchorage, Homer, Anchorage again, and then back to Seattle for a day, and then out to the East Coast to where I'm going to give a talk for the Coast Guard Officers Training Academy in Connecticut, and then down to Florida for the aquarium of the Florida Aquarium in Miami, and then home for Thanksgiving. So, and that's about it for the rest of the year. There's a couple other things up in Vancouver, but and I spent some time up in the Bay of Fundy also, doing some co-sponsored talks with the Nature Conservancy up there. So it's been wonderful. And one of the strange things about being a writer, and some of you probably know this and have experienced it, is that when you write, it's a very solitary process. You know, basically, I spent 7 years in a very small room, much smaller than this room, and doing research and writing. It's very solitary. And then when the book comes out, you go on tour, and it's the other end of the spectrum, right? Suddenly you're in front of people and you're talking about the book, and you're finding out what the response is generally to your book. And a lot of authors don't like that part of it, but I do. I really like this part of coming out and engaging with people about the subject, because I love it, obviously, and I love sharing it. But the tour has been a bit dizzying at times. Nevertheless, I'm very happy to be in Chicago with all of you tonight. I mean, Palmer. So I would imagine that some of you, probably a lot of you, know what this image is of. This is a tidal bore. And of course, you have a famous one on Turnagain Arm, not far from here. And tidal bores, when a tide goes up the river in the form of a wave or a solid wall of water. And I was surprised to learn when I did my research that there's actually a lot of these around the world. There's a number of them around the UK. There's 5 of them in the Bay of Fundy, although they're fairly small. There's some in India. There's a 15-foot tidal bore that goes up the Amazon River. And it can be seen and felt about 500 miles up that river. But this tidal bore on the Chentong River in China, just south of Shanghai, is the largest in the world. And it gets up to 25 feet tall. And it comes in on every tide, twice a day, and has done that for over 2,500 years. So what you're looking at here is, this doesn't work on the TV. So on the right-hand side there is the river. We're about 50 miles from the ocean here. And that's low tide in the river, the smooth part there that's reflecting the sun. And this is the tidal bore that's racing from the left to the right. It's moving about 15 miles per hour. And one of the unusual things about a tidal bore is we're so used to watching the tide come in over a long period of time on the coast, right? 6 hours from low tide to high tide, more or less. Well, with a tidal bore, if you're standing, like these are people here on the left-hand side, if you're standing at the low tide mark there, in 6 seconds, it's high tide. That wave comes through and the level of the water is at that wave. So it happens very, very fast. So there's, over the 2,500 years that the Chinese in this area have lived with this bore, there's a rich history of culture and mythology and literature and spirituality and science around this tidal bore. And I went there several times. And it's not surprising that the first tide chart in the world came out of the Chentong River. It was etched in stone in 1000 AD to predict the arrival of the bore. That's 200 years earlier than the first tide chart appeared in the West for the London Bridge. So there's the tidal bore in full bloom. So it gets up to 25 feet when it's coincident with a large storm in the East China Sea. And when it is, and that's often happens during the cyclone season in the fall, it jumps the jetty, typically, and floods acres and acres of very valuable farmland. And every year, people are taken by surprise and drowned by this tidal bore. Every year, sometimes hundreds of people. So, before I go a little bit deeper into this talk, I want to tell you several facts, tide facts, that are so amazing to me. That one of the reasons that I kept being drawn into this subject is I kept finding these kinds of facts along the way. So one of them is that the tide is a long, low wave that travels around the world at the speed of a modern jet, 450 miles per hour. Now, we don't experience it as a fast-moving phenomenon. In fact, anything but, right? When we're on the coast, what we see is the trough of that wave first, low tide, and then about 6 hours later, we see the crest, high tide, and then about another 6 hours later, we see the trough again. So about 12 hours from crest to crest, or trough to trough. So again, we don't see that as a fast-moving phenomenon, but that is a wave, a very low, fast-moving wave that's traveling around the world. It has no beginning and it has no end. It's a fully charged system. For 99.99999% of human history, we had no idea how the tides worked. It really wasn't until the very end of the scientific revolution when Newton and his colleagues gave us the laws of planetary motion and gravity so that we could just get a finger hold on what was going on with the tide. And in Newton's big opus, his Principia Mathematica, very heavy, big book that I went and saw. I saw the first edition in the Royal Society in London. In that book, there's only 4 pages that he talks about the tide. It was what was called the equilibrium theory, and it is the fundamental theory that we use today. It's wrong, but it is the theory that we use today, fundamentally, which basically said that the tide is a wave that travels around the world, and that it's influenced by gravity and planetary motion. But it's taken us 300 plus years since Newton and his colleagues at the end of the scientific revolution to really fill out the story of the tides. Today we know a lot, but we don't know everything about the tide. There are still mysteries. Yet, for all those hundreds, thousands of years before Newton, for certain, and there's not a good written record of this, but for certain, our ancestors who settled along the coast, because that's where they settled, because it was easy to make a living in the intertidal zone, that those people developed a really keen, practical understanding and knowledge about the tides, right? Because they could see what was going on up there with the moon and the sun, etc., and they could see the relationship, the practical relationship of what was going on in front of them in the intertidal zone. There's, of course, that native saying that when the tide is out, the table is set. So that's where our ancestors settled and made their living. So, for example, they knew that when the moon was full or new, it meant large tides, right? High highs and low lows. They also saw, of course, when the wind blew with the tide, it brought it in faster and higher. And when the wind blew against the tide, it held it back and made it lower. They also saw that when a storm blew through, what we now call low pressure, it relieved pressure on the ocean. We had higher tides, right? And when the sun was bright and there was high pressure, it pushed down on the ocean and meant lower tides. They probably also saw that sometimes the full moon looked larger in the sky and sometimes it looked smaller. And when it looked larger, there were larger tides, and when it looked smaller, there were smaller tides. And we know today that that's because the moon doesn't circle the Earth in a perfect circle. It's an oblong or eccentric circle. Sometimes it's closer to the Earth and sometimes it's further away. So when it's closer, we call that perigee, and when it's further away, it's epigee. And it has a big difference on the tide. You know, the king tides are when the moon is closest in perigee. And even perigee has its own cycle. Sometimes perigee is much closer than other perigees. So I'm convinced that our ancestors understood all of this. They had to. In fact, they had better reason to understand that than we do, because it was so integral to their survival. Yet they didn't know the mechanism. They didn't know how it worked. So I imagine if we were all out here on the coast and we had collected our clams and mussels or whatever for the day, and we had a fire going on the coast, and let's say it was evening and the moon came up full, a lot of us would have looked at it and wondered, how does the moon do it? How does the moon reach out over all that distance and invisibly and silently stir the waters of the earth? As you can imagine, there was a lot of speculation about this. Like some people thought that the moon did it by heating rocks on the bottom of the ocean. And when those rocks were heated, the water warmed and it swelled, and that was high tide. And when the moon went away, the rocks cooled, the water cooled and contracted, and that was low tide. A very plausible theory, actually one of the best, I think. Some people thought that the tide came and went through vents in the ocean floor. So when it went out here, it just went down through a vent and came out somewhere else. And astrologers were convinced that it was divine influence. And they cited women's menstrual cycles and the tides as evidence of that divine influence on Earth. And lots of people thought it was breathing, like the breathing of the Earth itself. A long inhale and exhale. Leonardo da Vinci was convinced it was a one giant beast that was breathing. And he was so convinced of it that he tried to calculate the size of its lung. And in Haida Gwaii, high tide woman makes high tide by lifting her skirt. So there are lots and lots of these stories. But again, they didn't know the mechanism. They didn't have the wherewithal to understand it. Remember that during these times, much of the time before the scientific revolution, in one way or another, the worldview was basically that the Earth was the center of the universe and it didn't move. Gravity had a long history, but it wasn't what we think of it today. It was soul. It was something else. So that didn't really come into play until much later. So one last fact before I go on. The tides create friction by rubbing against the ocean floor. So every little eddy, every little string of tension that you see on the surface is indication of friction, of water trying to move, and it just can't move fast enough. It's rubbing against the bottom. And there is so much of this friction globally that it actually is a force that slows down the rotation of the Earth. So by a very small amount, every day, the Earth is turning slower, and our days are getting longer because of the tide. And this same force is pushing the moon away at the rate of about 10 feet in a human lifetime. So about 400 million years ago or more, the moon was much closer to the Earth, and it's speculated that we had 100 to 200 foot tides every 2 hours, completely awashing all the land masses. And about 600 million years ago, our days were 21 hours long, not 24, because of the slowing of the Earth. So a little bit more about my history. I grew up in Southern California, surfing, sailing, diving. I feel like I lived on the water, and probably like a lot of you, seems like I always had a tide chart in my back pocket. And after college, I built a small boat and sailed in the Pacific and the Atlantic. And then in my mid-20s, I went back up to Seattle, and I was going to go back to school, but I found a picture of an old wooden boat for sale. And it's that boat right there, Crusader, a 65-foot halibut schooner. And she was down in Tillamook, and I went down there. It was a drippy, cold February day, and I went down below, and they had a wood stove going. It was nice and warm, and I could smell rotting wood. And the boat was painted all orange, and it leaked about 150 gallons a day, and it was perfect. So I bought the boat, and I started my own school on the boat, Resource Institute, a nonprofit educational organization. And for the next 11 years, we sailed from Seattle up to Southeast Alaska, around Haida Gwaii and Vancouver Island, doing seminars on the boat. So we do these week-long seminars with topics like in natural history or photography, writing, psychology, whale research, all kinds of things, you name it. And we had lots of different people on board leading those seminars. And my first book actually came out of that. It was a collection of interviews about our relationship with nature. And we had a lot of great times during those 11 years, but one not so fun time was going aground in a gale and a large tide up in Southeast Alaska, just north of Sitka in Kalinin Bay, just the northern part of Kruzof Island. And we were coming back from Chichagof Island. It was a beautiful day, a lot like today. And I heard on the radio that there was going to be a gale. So I picked this quiet anchorage, and we went in and had dinner and anchored. And about 4 in the morning, I woke up to relieve myself off the stern, and I noticed that something wasn't right. Now, when you walk on a boat that's afloat, there's a feeling underfoot. It's a very distinctive feeling. It's like a hollowness or a resonance. It's hard to describe, but it's very clear when it's not there. Very clear. It feels like you're walking on concrete. And that's what had happened. We had dragged anchor, the gale had come up, and we dragged anchor all the way across the bay and slid into the soft mud. So I didn't wake up. It wasn't a bounce off a rock or something like that. So we slid into the mud, and we were about 2 feet in the mud. And it turns out that we were at the top of a 16-foot tide. Slack water, high water. So I knew in the next 6 hours, the boat was going to go all the way down. All the water around her was going to go away. Well, here I was in my underwear, my rubber boots. It was dark, it was blowing a gale, and I had 12 paying passengers on board. So we got everybody off, and there was bear sign all over the beach, so we posted somebody with a rifle. And 2 crew and I stayed behind. And what happened was the boat went all the way down, of course, and where we thought she'd just come back up with the next tide, she got stuck in the mud, and she opened up. So as the tide came back in, the boat didn't right itself, the tide just came into the boat. And so by mid-morning, we were swimming through the boat. The Coast Guard came and they had other distress calls up the coast, so they dropped 3 pumps and gas and said, good luck, we've got to go take care of these other boats. And it was those pumps actually that saved the boat, because we eventually got enough water out of the boat that it bounced back up. And we had sent the participants back to Sitka in a fish boat, and the crew and I stayed all the way through the night because the engine was completely submerged. So we had to take it apart and flush it with fresh water. But we went under our own power back to Sitka that next morning, and 3 days later it went out on the next seminar. We had to completely rewire the boat. So I like to say that after that experience, I got the tide out of Crusader, but I couldn't get it out of my head. And so I decided that it was time to learn what was going on. And again, I knew the moon had something to do with it, but I wasn't sure what. And I thought that I'd read an article or two, take a couple of weeks and learn everything there was to know about the tide. I mean, how complicated could it be? But I was wrong. The more I read, the more complicated, the more fascinating, the more poetic it became. So a couple of articles, a couple of books turned into 10, and then 50, and then 100, and then 300, and a couple of weeks turned into 10 years. And I took a break in between times. I got married and we had a child and built a house and so forth, but I didn't forget about the tide. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I committed to writing this book. And it's been an intense journey of travel and research and writing for those full 7 years. And the reason I wrote the book really was that, I love to read pure science. I love to read textbooks. But what I wasn't finding in the textbooks is the human story. That there's, as much as there is a scientific story about the tide, there's also a really deep, rich human story about our long-term and deep relationship with the tide, with the coastal environments. And so I wanted to bring that to light. I wanted to thread those together, the science and the humanity. So basically what I did was I took some element of the tide, and I went to where it was most dramatically at play in the world. So for a chapter on waves, how the tide is like a wave and how it's not like a wave, I went to the big wave surf contest at Mavericks, just west of San Francisco. So every year they have this big wave contest, and they only call it when they know they're going to have the largest waves in the winter. And it's an invitation only. And I spent time with one of the world-class surfers, Greg Long, and he got me on the press boat. And so this chapter is really about the story about Mavericks and these big waves and Greg Long. Because as it turns out, just a month before I met him, he almost lost his life in a surfing accident off the coast of California, Cortez Bank. It's about 60 miles off the coast of San Diego. And he was surfing in about 70 or 80 foot waves. And he fell. And he got pushed down. And then he got held down through 3 more set waves. So he eventually blacked out. And he was pronounced dead. And they revived him. He came back out. A near fatal drowning is what they call it. And surprisingly, he not only wanted to talk about it, but he was extremely articulate about it. Every second of that experience for him, being held down, and then knowing that at one point he was going to black out, and even having to decide, is he going to black out down there, or is he going to take his last few seconds to get up to the surface so that possibly somebody could see him, even though he might get hit by another wave. So the story of that chapter is really about Greg Long, and again threaded with the tide and how it's like these waves and how it's not like these waves. And then for a chapter on the cultural and spiritual history of the tide, the ancient history, I went to Mont Saint-Michel in France. And this is a Benedictine monastery that was built in the 5th century AD. And it's been a practicing monastery ever since then. There was a brief time where it was a prison during World War II, but basically it's been a place where monks and sisters go to to practice their spiritual relationship with God. This is a 45-foot tide. It's the largest in mainland Europe. And it probably looks a lot like some of the flats around here. When the tide is out, the ocean is about 10 miles away. And if you stand at the top of that monastery, as I did, and watched it come in, you can barely see this molten silver thread on the horizon. Maybe you can see that here, I don't know. But, and then within minutes, the tide is galloping across these flats, which are full of quicksand too, as I know we have out here. And one of the naturalists said to me that if you're out there and the tide comes up to your ankles, within 2 minutes it'll be at your waist and carry you away. Again, probably not unlike here. So when I went there, and a lot of the places I went more than once because I couldn't get the whole story one time. In fact, in this day of quick information on the internet, it's surprising how some of these things are just not accessible. In fact, in many of these cases, I finally had to just close the computer, pack my bag, and go and just see what I could see there, knowing it was a reconnaissance trip, perhaps the first time. And Mont Saint-Michel was one of those examples. And I went there, and I really wanted to interview the monks because I figured that with this phenomenon being wrapped in the tide like this, that it would have some influence on their spiritual life. And I couldn't get to them. They were very elusive. This is a UNESCO heritage site, so there's lots and lots of people there, shoulder to shoulder going through these narrow streets. And the monks are very elusive. They disappear, the robes flapping, they disappear through doors, and you can't get to them. So I worked with a guide there when I left, and she interpreted my letters. And it took about 2 years, but I finally got an invitation to a silent lunch and a half-hour interview with the monks. And I got to pick my time, so I picked the largest tide of the year. And so this chapter is all about this interview with the monks. And I did get my silent, of course, lunch, and I got the half-hour interview turned into an hour. And I got to pick the largest tide of the year, so I went there during that time. And I spent a week with them and wandering through the monastery. And then for a chapter on tide energy, I went to 2 places also. Northern Scotland, the Orkney Islands, where they're doing the most amount of tide energy research and tide wave energy research in the world. These kinds of devices are in and out of the water all the time. And just for scale, one of those red canisters on the left-hand side is about the size of a person. And then for that same chapter, I went to the southern tip of Chile, to the Straits of Magellan, where they have tremendous tide energy resources and a very strong incentive to develop it because they import most of their energy. But they don't have any devices in the water yet. In fact, as you probably know, the whole southern third of Chile, from Puerto Montt south, is almost a mirror image of Southeast Alaska and the Alaskan archipelago. It's very small communities. A lot of them are off the grid. Lots of salmon fishing there, and the populations are very small. And they could use small, appropriate-sized tide energy devices to run some of these small communities. So there is this very strong incentive, and I think within the next 5 years, they will probably have devices in the water. But none that I know of so far. None certainly when I was down there just a few years ago. And then for a chapter on ancient and future tides, where I talked about sea level rise and tides over time, I went to 2 places also. I went to the San Blas Islands that are just east of Panama, right about at the equator, and they stretch almost all the way down to Colombia. There's about 350 of these very low-lying coral islands that are occupied by the Cunayala Indians and have been occupied for about 250 years by them. And as you can see, they crowd these islands, and the elevations are so low. The tides are not large, 8, 10 inches, 12 inches sometimes, but the tide is always at their ankles, always. And they have two views of the tide. One is a traditional view that tells them the tide is a spiritual visitor from another dimension, come to check up on the village. And the tide comes in, and if it finds everything is okay, it recedes like it normally would. But if it's not okay, it stays. And then they have sober-minded scientists within their community that tell them that if sea level rises 3 feet in the next 50 years, as it's conservatively estimated to do there, they will lose all their island homes and they have to move. So they are making plans to move, but they are keeping both these views in mind as they do it. First, the science, and also that this is a spiritual problem also. They're famous for these molas. I'm sure you've seen these around. There's about 35,000 Kuniyala that live on these islands. And then I went to Venice, Italy for the same chapter to explore a modern city and how they're dealing with it. And as you probably know, Venice was founded in about the 5th century AD, and it's had tide flooding problems ever since it was founded. And those have been exacerbated in the last 50 years because they've been extracting groundwater and the land is sinking faster than it should. They've stopped that, but the land is still sinking quite fast. So it means that the net difference is a large amount of sea level rise in that area. In fact, today, San Marcos Square, one of the lower parts of the city, floods 70 times a year like this. And these wood platforms are called passerellas, and they're always stacked around the city. This is a walking city, right? And when they know it's going to be a large tide, and they all know, there's sirens around the city when it's going to be large. Everybody has an app. They get a text in the morning about tides. Everybody's very much aware of the tides there, like some of the coastal people here. And so when they know there's going to be a large tide, the public works folks come and set up these passerellas. All the hotels issue rubber boots. The Venetians themselves all have rubber boots. And there's an exceptional tide in San Marcos Square. There's a bookstore in Venice that's at the lowest elevation, and it's called Acqua Alta bookstore. And it's a tiny bookstore about half the size of this room, and it's loaded with books, and they're raised up off the floor in bathtubs and gondolas and kayaks and so forth. And it's kind of messy, and it's owned by this old curmudgeon guy. And he stays open all the time, even during the high tides, up to the knee level. And I went there during a high tide, of course, and I'm in there with my rubber boots, browsing the books. And every once in a while, he'd bark at people and say, "Don't splash and don't make any waves." And one of the interesting things about Venice is that we're so accustomed to seeing the tide come and go on the coast that we can't even imagine it belonging anywhere else or happening anywhere else. But in Venice, the tide bubbles up through slots in the cobblestone and disappears down those through the stormwater system. It doesn't come up over the barrier, or it doesn't do that. It's very interesting. So in this bookstore, I'm in there when it was dry, low tide, and went back. I was kind of monitoring, right? And I started to see it bubble up through the cobblestone and come up and actually get up to about my shin level when I was there. So then for the largest tides in the world, I went to 2 places also, the Bay of Fundy and Ungava Bay, which is about 1,300 miles due north of the Bay of Fundy. And these places have record tides of 54 feet 6 inches, which is not just 6 inches or a foot larger than the next largest tide. It's 10 feet larger than the next largest tide. So the guiding question on that trip was, why would you have a tide like that? And why only in 2 places in the world? What's going on there? And then why would you have a tide that is almost nothing in the Baltic or the Mediterranean or the Gulf of Mexico? What would cause these differences? And so again, I spent 4 summers in the Bay of Fundy. And then I went up to the Arctic one summer. Again, this is one of those experiences where I couldn't find anything, any information from afar. And I finally just had to shut down my computer, pack up a bag and go. And I went to a little village called Tasuiaq. And I spent a week there. And on my way back, I was in Kuujjuaq, the hub of Nunavik. And I overheard a conversation about chopping a hole in the ice in midwinter at the right tides and going down underneath the ice during low tide when it's hollow down there to forage for fresh blue mussels. So I waited around till the conversation was over, and then I introduced myself to Lukasi Napaluk, one of these men, and he eventually invited me to join him. So I went home and I rented Arctic gear, and it took a couple of years, 2.5 years, with a lot of different calls back and forth, because every time I'd call, he'd say, no, it's not right. And then finally he said, it's right, come now. So I grabbed my gear and got onto progressively smaller planes until I finally landed in his small village of Kangasuiaq in a cargo plane loaded with Coca-Cola and ammunition. And I spent a week with Lukasi, and we went down underneath the ice, and a number of times, in fact. And it was really an eerie experience, scary in some ways, but otherworldly, like going into a womb, because the temperature outside was negative Fahrenheit, temperature outside, and then just 7, 8, 9 feet down below the ice in the intertidal zone, it was 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So 60 to 70 degree difference in 7, 8 feet when you jump down through this hole. Yeah. And you've got to pick exactly the right tide, of course, and you only have a small window. Just as the tide as it was dropping, almost at slack, low water, and then you have to get out 2 to 3 hours later, of course, before the tide comes back in. And the tide, because it's such a large tide, you can watch it come in and go out, right? It's moving that fast. It's like filling up a bathtub. You can see it fill and lower. And so it was a amazing experience, and I used that experience to as a context to talk again about these large tides and why they happen. And that's me on the right, and that's Lukasi on the left. And that's his village, Kangasuiaq. So I'm going to shift just a little bit to introduce a short film that I have, and this is kind of the conclusion of what I have. And then if you have some questions, I'd be happy to answer them or try to answer them. But by way of introducing this film, I'm going to talk a little bit about the basic science of this, about tides. And one of the things that I had to learn as a researcher on this journey was that the tide is a lot of things, and it's complicated, as I said. There are many, many layers to it, like peeling an onion. And just when you think you understand one part of it, then you peel it and you find out there's another part, or there's something that's apparently contradictory, in fact. And this is not a new, the challenge or the confusion about this or the difficulty of understanding is not a new thing. I mean, scientists over time memorial have struggled with this. In fact, Aristotle was rumored to have committed suicide because he wanted to understand the tides and he couldn't figure it out. It's said that he threw himself into the ocean saying, "Comprehend me, since I cannot comprehend thee." And then sometime later, Laplace, the French Newton, said that tides were the thorniest problem in science. And then I sat with a world-renowned tide modeler in the Bay of Fundy, David Greenberg, just year or so ago at his office in the Bay of Fundy. And I asked him, I said, can you describe an aha moment with a tide? And he was uncharacteristically quiet for a minute, and then he said, I don't have aha moments, only oh God moments when the tide does something I never thought it would do. So it's a great way to demonstrate that this has been a challenge all the way through history. And again, there are still mysteries. There's still things we don't know about. But anyway, from a simplified point of view, you can break it down into two parts. One is what's happening up there, what's known as astronomy, the field of astronomy, and then what's happening down here, what we call fluid dynamics, what's happening in the ocean actually. And then you could even break down the second part, fluid dynamics, what's happening down here, into two parts. One is what's happening in the deep ocean, and then what's happening in the shallow waters, because that's where it gets really complicated. In the deep ocean, there's an 18-inch tide pretty much everywhere. And the moon is the predominant factor, right? But the sun is 50% of that. So in the deep ocean, the moon is causing about a 12-inch tide everywhere. And the sun is contributing about 6 inches. So you've got an 18-inch tide. And all that goes to hell as soon as the tide crosses the continental shelf. And as physicists say, the further in you go, the more sticky it gets. And that's primarily because of friction. So it reflects, it refracts, it stumbles, it speeds up, it slows down, it hits islands, it hits jetties, it wraps around corners, it folds back on itself. It just gets intensely complicated. And in fact, to understand what's happening in any one place, like what's happening right out here, you have to take that one place and unpack it. You have to look at it and pull it all apart and understand what's happening there, because what's happening there may not be what's happening a mile down the beach or 2 miles or 50 miles. In fact, quite likely not, especially in inland waters. So when you stir this pot long enough, what you get down to is vibration, or more specifically, resonance. When something vibrates in response to something else. So scientists over time have identified all these different relationships of the Earth, Moon, and Sun, primarily the Moon and Sun relative to the Earth, right? And they've frozen these relationships, like we know new moon, full moon, quarter moon, three-quarter moon, moon in perigee, moon in epigee, all these different things, right? Well, there's over 400 of those relationships. And scientists, to understand the tide, have frozen them and given them names. They're not very poetic names like M2, M1, S1, S2. But again, there are over 400 of these things. And what you're going to see in this film is a demonstration of how those frozen relationships are like beats or pulses, and that how the oceans respond to them through resonance. So we're all familiar with resonance, right? I mean, it's when you play guitar, when you pluck the strings of the guitar, the body of the guitar resonates with the chord, and it exaggerates it, it makes it rich and full. When we drive down a rutted road, and if we drive at just the right speed, our car resonates with the bumps, right? It feels like it's going to shake apart. If we speed up or slow down, it breaks the resonance. On Crusader, when I hit 1200 RPM, all the windows in the pilot house rattled. So I'd speed up or slow down to stop. So they were resonating with the throb of the diesel engine. We know resonance when we sing in the shower, right? So every shower stall has a tendency to vibrate or to resonate with certain notes. And it happens to be the notes that we can sing in that range. And every shower stall is different in that way. But when we sing in the shower, we're singing along and we hit a C and a D and an F or whatever, and then we hit an E, and suddenly the shower stall resonates with our voice. And it gets deep and rich and full, and sometimes we feel the resonance in our chest cavity or our skull cavity. And we feel brilliant, right, in that moment. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm a singer. So what does this have to do with the tide? Well, if you blow up the analogy of singing in the shower to the size of the universe, it's exactly how the tides work. So the singing, the notes, are these various relationships of the moon, the sun, and the earth, right? The full moon, new moon, on, right? All these 400 relationships, you could say that those are notes. And the shower stall is the ocean basins of the world. All of them different. And when you look out over the Pacific, you think one basin, but actually there are many, many basins within that basin, all defined by different topography, the depth, the width of those basins, even the temperature of the water and the salinity make up how it's going to resonate. So one basin might resonate to one voice or one note, and another basin not too far away would resonate with another one. So with that, I'm going to show you this film. When I was researching my book, I was surprised to learn that music can teach us a lot about how the tides work. I know it sounds a little far-fetched, but think about it. When you pluck the string of a guitar, the body of the guitar resonates. This also happens in the shower stall when you sing and you hit that note that suddenly sounds deep and rich. That's the shower stall resonating with your voice. The tides work the same way, although in this case, the musical notes are the gravitational pulses from the sun and moon, and the resonating body are the ocean basins of the earth. We think of gravity as a constant, and it is, but its strength varies depending on where the sun and moon are. The moon's gravitational pull, for example, is strongest when it's full, or overhead, or closest to the earth. In the study of tides, these positions are called beats, or pulses. But for our purposes today, let's call them notes. I wanted to find a way to clearly demonstrate this, so I asked some musicians to help out. What's happening here today is we're squeezing the whole universe down into the size of this chapel. You guys are the sun and the moon, and these cans are the ocean basins of the world. Resonance is when something vibrates in response to something else. So it's very much like your instruments here and your voice. So that's what we're doing today. Those frequencies are very long, over 12, 24 hours, sometimes over 2 weeks. Your frequencies today look like this. You know, they're in seconds, right? These cans are all different shapes and sizes. Some are deep, some are wide, some are shallow. The smallest one's a sardine can. That largest one is a garbage can. It's just like the ocean basins of the earth, all different shapes and sizes. And each ocean basin responds differently to the same astronomical note. And that's why you can have a tide on one beach that's big and then travel a mile down the way and you don't have much tide. It's because that basin is resonant with some note from the moon or sun, and the next beach a mile away is not. We're going to experiment with the notes that you guys play with your instruments and how it excites or does not excite different basins right here in front of you. So in some simplified way, what you all are trying to do is get the salt to bounce. What you're seeing here is the notes of the clarinet are causing just those particular cans to resonate. And when those cans resonate, the salt moves. Let's continue going on one at a time. activate these kind of one at a time separately? I think that did it. I think that did it. They're not all just going off, but it's a particular note that's hitting this one and that one and that one. Notice it makes a difference what note he plays, how loud he plays it, and how close he is to the cans or the ocean basins. Let's try the saw. Oh, there you go, the little can. Why don't you go, Dimitri? That's the first time the large can has resonated. It's responding to the low frequencies of the tuba. Nice. Everybody join in. Let's just mess around and see what happens. The results of the experiment were remarkable. We created a miniature universe, and I think we got closer to understanding how resonance shapes the tides. Thank you. So just in conclusion, I mentioned earlier that we know a lot about the tides, but we don't know everything. And there are actually quite a few mysteries. But one of them is, what is the tides' relationship with seismic activity, with volcanoes and earthquakes and so forth? It makes good common sense that there would be a relationship, but it hasn't been proven scientifically. In fact, it's been assumed that there's a relationship there for many hundreds of years, in fact. So not only just the tugging of the moon and the sun on the oceans, but also the moving of the oceans around the planet, right? I mean, large tides coming and going against the coast, it's a huge amount of weight that's shifting around. So I think that we're going to find out a lot about that over the years to come. And then one other one is biological rhythms. We know that there are a lot of creatures in the intertidal zone that are tuned to lunar and tidal rhythms. In fact, one of the first chapter in the book, I talk about a very small mud shrimp called a chirophium in the Bay of Fundy that lives in the flats there. And it has 2 tide clocks in it. One that tells them what the tide is doing on a day-to-day basis, and then one that tells them what the tide's doing on a monthly basis for spawning purposes. So this is a creature the size of a grain of rice, and it's got 2 tide clocks in it. And we don't know where they are, and we don't know how they work. So there are many, many creatures that have this, and a number of marine scientists that I spoke to said that they not only think that we're going to learn a lot more about that, but we're probably going to learn that vestiges of these same lunar and tidal clocks are within the human body as well. So anyway, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions if you have them. Yes.
If the coral reefs, if we lose coral reefs, how will that affect the tides? Do you have any idea?
Well, I would hazard to say probably not an effect on the tide. Unless it changes, unless over a very, very long period of time we start to change the shape of the bottom in those areas, right? And then it would change the resonant quality of those basins. Yeah. A different problem.
Well, if nobody's got anything. Years ago, I was teaching at what we call here Old Palmer High School. And one of my unpaid for responsibilities was kind of monitor the girls' bathroom. And so on this particular day, one of the other teachers came very upset that, because we usually left the door to the girls' bathroom open because there were stalls was relatively private. So usually that door stood open. And it was one of our older teachers, and she was incensed that it seemed as if there were people in the bathroom and there was music playing. And so earlier that day, I had gone in because a couple of girls had one of those little 45 record players, and they had been playing records sitting on the floor in front of 3 stalls, one over here. So I said, oh, well, the girls are in there playing music. Well, a teacher who was kind of in jeopardy a lot of the times taught drama there, and these 2 girls had gone down to class when class opened and said, hey, Mr. Johnson, we just found her. I'm telling you, the way the echoes are in that girls' bathroom, it's just great. So he took his drama class in there without telling anybody anything. And they had class in the women's bathroom. And the librarian was not happy. But anyway, now when you said this, it is so remarkable to me to think about, because we never thought about resonance. We only thought about the echo in that room.
No, that's exactly what's happening. That's wonderful. It's a great teacher. Yeah, that's great. Some of the ancient chapels, right, were designed to resonate with the human voice. And in fact, one of the very early on, people were keyed into this, and from a spiritual point of view, and the monks and sisters that sang, the whole idea was that they would they would have your cavities in your body resonate, right? They'd hit the notes that typically resonate there in your chest or your head to enhance the spiritual feeling. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that we resolved that morning was that if a teacher wanted to use the bathroom for a classroom, they must put a sign on the door that said out of order.
It's only fair.
In order.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, just one little quick story around that. George Darwin, Charles Darwin's son, got into tides. He spent a lot of time working with tides, and he was convinced that the origin of the moon was that there was a time when the Pacific Ocean resonated so heavily with the sun that it was sloshing around so violently that it threw the moon out of the Pacific. It was a real theory for quite a while, of course, since disproven, but he was convinced that there was so much resonance that was going on.
Something relevant to, I'm Michael, something relevant to Pomeranians, as I like to call us, is that we have a gravel pit 3 miles south, just south of Fairgrounds. And they do their business, and they gather gravel for anchorage operations and for road safety. And at my house, which is about a mile, maybe half a mile east of the gravel pit, during the summer, when they're dredging and pulling up the gravel, there's one particular place in my house that I can walk and stand, and the resonance is unnerving. It's like the brown noise, if you're familiar. It makes you feel unsettled and uncomfortable, and it's in that one particular place in the house, and we don't like it, but it's the business, and they have their rights, and I'm a libertarian, so. But I'd rather not deal with that resonance.
Well, that's a great story. Well, there are dampeners. You might be able to experiment with a dampener somehow, adding something to the building some way that changes a resonant quality of your room. Like, I'm a tennis player, and I wouldn't play without a dampener on the tennis racket. You guys, anybody a tennis player here? You know that they put little dampeners on the racket, little tiny, just something to interrupt the resonant frequency of the racket, so that when you hit the ball, it doesn't vibrate. Well, I don't know. You might be able to move the furniture around.
It's the bathroom.
Oh, okay. Well, add a stall. Something to change the shape of the basin, or put a different surface on the walls. I don't know.
Just encourages you to go in and go out.
Velvet Elvis
Yes.
painting in there.
Velvet Elvis painting.
There you go.
It'll do something to the feng shui. I
Let's all go over there and experiment.
No, they're done for the season.
I lived in Sitka for a number of years, and a close friend of mine was a Tlingit elder. And he said, you know, people talk about Indian time, you know, like we're always going to be late for everything. He said, but my people, Tlingit means the people of the tides. And we were always punctual because we could not be late for the tides. We had to know exactly when to go out and when to come in.
That's awesome.
Yeah, very good.
Okay,
Yes.
so this is the passage in the book that when I read it, I got most excited because my favorite thing to do is go tide pooling. Anytime there's a low tide and I can get to a beach, I want to go out there and bring my camera and, you know, look for sea anemones and, you know, nudibranchs and all sorts of weird animals that are living in the intertidal. And I've actually planned vacations around, oh gosh, there's a big low tide and my friend has that weekend off, we're gonna go out to Vancouver Island. I lived out in Bellingham for a while, so easy access to a lot of beaches. So I read, this is when you're talking about all of the various factors going into the tides, page 262. Meanwhile, every year has a highest tide, as does every decade, every century. These vary in height from port to port depending on local resonances, proximity to amphidromic systems, or other shallow water effects. San Francisco will see an exceptional tide in December 2026 and 2057, New York in November 2038 and December 2052, and Galveston in December 2039 and 2057. So tell me more about these like really exceptional high tides, because that means really exceptional low tides. And I was trying to figure out how to look this up. Like, what is the best low tide in my lifetime in Seldovia and in Napolet? And I want to plan out my travel for the rest of my life.
Good luck with that.
What are the search terms I can use, or where do I dig up this info?
Oh, gosh. Well, it's not easy, actually. I actually I hired a oceanographer to help me plot this all out. And I spent quite a bit of time with them. And, you know, if, you know, like I mentioned earlier, you've got over 400 of these cycles. And, but it's also true that once you get out beyond, you know, 100, you're talking about an influence of fractions of inches. So it gets less and less interesting. But like, for example, in the United States, NOAA creates our tide charts, right? And they use harmonic analysis to do that. That's resonance. So this is real. This is what they use to determine the tide charts, harmonic resonance. So, but they break down these, what they call constituents. I called them beats or pulses, right? They call them constituents. So they break that down. And generally, in the United States, we use 35 of those to come up with our tide charts. Now, other places like the Mediterranean that have hardly any tide, they don't really care that much about it because it's not such a big influence. So they use 10. However, when NOAA needs a more distilled chart or exacting prediction, they use more, of course. So in Cook Inlet, they use 80. The largest number of constituents that any tide chart making organization does in the world. 80 constituents right here.
Actually, that was the other thing.
And that's because of the commercial traffic and the oil and the tides and the rocks, right? And because NOAA is primarily interested in these tide charts because they want to make commercial traffic safe. Really, that's their main goal. But anyway, so getting back to what you're saying, so, you know, if you take those, the predominant factors, you could even say that generally we are going to have our largest tides of the year in December or January. Because during, let's say, a Phrygian tide, when the moon is closest to the Earth, during full or new moon, and it's also the time when the Earth is closest to the sun, and the sun is having its largest influence. However, there are a lot of other things that can change that, and including weather. And So as I said in that reference there, it depends on their resonating factors and what, like for example, the Bay of Fundy is more resonant with the perigee-epigee cycle than it is with full and new moon. It just happens that it's more responsive to that. So every place has its difference. I'm sorry, I'm being very vague. I'm just basically piling on more complexity to it.
Well, I mean, how far out do they calculate those tide charts? Because I mean, I'll sometimes look ahead,
18.6 years.
Okay.
Okay.
That gives me a good head start. And then, what's a good search term to use to try dig up this information?
I think you could start with the NOAA website. And then, they're really good. You can ask questions on it. And if you started asking questions, either they would answer them or they'd lead you to somebody else that could.
Okay.
Yeah. So the 18.6 year cycle, by the way, is the cycle, of course, our relationship to the Earth, to the sun, changes by 23.5 degrees south and then north through the course of the year, right? Well, our relationship with the moon moves around like a hummingbird compared to the sun, our relationship with the sun. The moon travels all the way up to about 28 degrees north latitude, and then all the way down to 28 degrees south latitude every month relative to us. However, it varies in how high it goes each month. So sometimes it goes to 23 degrees, and sometimes it goes to 28 degrees. Are you following me? So sometimes it goes more extreme. Well, that 18.6 year cycle is when it is that extreme cycle of the moon. So it hits that 28 degrees north and south in a month every 18.6 years. And it's significant enough among all those constituents that we use to determine the tide that the tide chart basically repeats itself every 18.6 years when the moon is up high. But that's one of those 400 cycles, right? Yeah.
So, of course, on top of the 400 cycles, we have sea level rise. And on top of that, we have some areas of the Earth that are actually sinking or dropping, say as glaciers melt, some of them areas are sinking. Is NOAA or anyone able to start modeling how that changes the resonance in the tides as you change by 6 inches or a foot in a particular area?
It's a really good question about, I think are you picking up these questions over here? Okay, so I don't need to repeat them. To my knowledge, they haven't come up with a model that's doing that yet, but of course there's a lot of interest in it. And even the smallest differences can make a big difference in terms of the tide. And of course, this is what we're seeing or going to see. For example, there are places where we've been dredging, like over in Europe, that inadvertently have changed the tide regimes in these places. And a good example is the Bay of Fundy. 3,500 years ago, a blink of an eye, the Bay of Fundy wasn't resonant, and it didn't have large tides. And as the ice has melted and sea levels have risen, 14,000 years ago, sea level was 450 feet lower than it is today, right? So as the glaciers retreated and melted and sea level rose about 3,500 years ago, it rose enough to flood in over George's Bank and flood the Bay of Fundy and make it close to resonance. And it's becoming more resonant as time goes on. So that's only 3,500 years. I think it had something I talk about in the book, but I think it had a 15-foot tide 3,500 years ago. And so that's an example of how it is changing, how fast it can change. Of course, these things are not, I don't know that we're going to see a lot of this kind of thing in our lifetime, but as we know, sea level rise is a locked-in phenomenon. And whether global warming is going to speed it up or not, and most of us believe, of course, and scientific evidence is that it will speed it up, but it's also a natural process, and we are in a warming process. So sea level rise is going to happen anyway. As Rachel Carson says, today a little more land belongs to the ocean, tomorrow a little less. I mean, this is an ongoing large process.
say it would affect all bodies of water, right?
Yes,
Fresh and salt water, right?
yes,
Any size,
yes,
anything, like even like this.
that's
You
right.
wouldn't notice it, but it does.
That's right.
No, even people?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I often say that, we have a tide in our morning cup of coffee, but it'd be really hard to measure it. Yeah, yeah, and they say that when the moon is overhead, our body weight changes by about the drop of sweat. Yeah.
So is there any research on like how people are affected? Like
There is research. There was a book called The Lunar Effect some years ago, but, from a scientific point of view, the scientific community kind of frowns on that.
Yeah.
There isn't a lot of really good, hard scientific proof, yet there is a lot of observation. And as one of the things that's come out of my travels and giving these talks all over is that people who have observed their coast for a long time often have observed phenomenon that there is no ready scientific explanation for. And I've come to respect that science doesn't explain everything. And there are phenomenon that we don't know the answer to. So like I was saying earlier, one of the mysteries is we don't know exactly how the lunar and tidal rhythms are affecting our own lives. But I think we're going to find out more and more that that's true. It makes sense. Really, it does. A bird that's roosting in a tree 3 miles from the coast travels to the coast knowing it's going to be low tide. They can't see it, right? It's in their body.
I have one. When you said about the coral reefs not making any difference, but yet you're talking about the shallower water feeling the rivulets and everything else on the ocean floor. What about putting these, the windmills and the tidal things and all that kind of stuff in the ocean? What's that? Is that going to affect the tides in some way? I think it's a great idea as opposed to drilling, for oil personally, but, if it's going to, the last thing we need to do is mess up the ocean because we've already messed it up.
That's a great question. Did you just come up with that?
Yes.
You did?
Well, I thought about it when you showed that thing and having been
Yeah.
on the North Sea coast of Scotland and Ireland too, not the North Sea, but seeing the windmills out there, wind farms, and the opposition that people or whoever, I don't know, seems like, gosh, we don't want those and we blah, 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 blah. And also about Venice putting up those gates to keep the tides out from flooding their city and stuff. So, that is all, it's changing that. It's changing the rhythms and it's changing the volume. I would think that it would change something.
Yeah.
Is that not true? I don't know.
No. It's a really good point, and it's one of the controversial parts of developing tide energy. Well, let me first say that I've spent most of my adult life in marine and land conservation, and before I started this book and the research, I was a naysayer about tide energy, in part because of what you're saying, but also the environmental impact and the unknowns about how it's affecting animal life, mammal life, especially where I live. We have resident orcas and so forth. But in my research and through the writing of this book, I completely came around, and I'm an advocate of it. In a lot of reasons you just brought up, that I think if it's done appropriately, it's not the silver bullet, but I think it's a viable part of the green energy, renewable energy picture with wind and solar. But what it has over those is it's very predictable, dependable, right? So it does come up about friction, about it can change the friction, especially if it's done, if it's overdone. And that's the key, I think. If it's not done, if it's done appropriately, I think that we'd have to put an awful lot of devices in the water before we change the friction, where we'd actually add to the slowing of the earth by doing that.
slowing of the earth is just, well, maybe, ultimately, I guess it would be the slowing of the earth. But, when you go flying from the continental United States across the ocean to Australia, there is a whole lot of water out there. I mean, it is just, you think about the ocean, and I grew up in Central California, we went to the beach all the time. And you see the water and, it's, okay, there's the water and there's the ocean. But when you get out there in a plane, that's like nothing out there but water. And, I would think there would be some ways to do something out there where, it does not, the huge fluctuation that is close in the shallow, off the coast, but, it wouldn't have to be that much to generate that much energy, I don't think. I'm not a scientist, but gosh, we ought to be doing something, I think.
Well, there's a long history of harnessing the power of the tides. Very long history, much more longer than most of us realize. In fact, in the 16th century, there were thousands of tide mills all over Europe, and in fact, on the east coast of the United States. The first one was in the Bay of Fundy area in 1620 or something. And now there are hundreds of them along the eastern seaboard. So these were whole communities that built up around these tide mills that were placed at a river mouth typically. And now the engineering is such that we're experimenting more with what they call in-stream tidal energy devices. And these are devices that look more like a windmill, but they're placed underneath the water. And yes, exactly. That's one of them.
Okay,
But
I've not seen that before.
yeah, it's still in its very infant stages in a lot of ways. An example is that one of the other testing sites in the world is called Force, and it's in Basin in the Bay of Fundy, and where they have a lot of current there. And they put a device down there that looked like a windmill with blades about 60 feet in diameter, and they put it down, and it crumpled in about 2 weeks' time. And the people at Force said, well, the good news about that is there's more power down there than we thought. And the bad news is we've got a long ways to go before we can develop devices. But you can imagine, like even as you say, and I know it was sort of a rhetorical comment, but all that ocean out there, but you've got to get the power to where the power is needed, right? So that's one of the problems. For example, one of the very best identified tide energy sites in the world is right up here in the Aleutian Straits. But there's not the need for the power up there, right? So it has to be close to a grid, a place where there's a need for the power. So there's all kinds of criteria that go into these things. And they've got a lot of engineering hoops to jump through. There are a lot of devices in the water generating power today. But they're smaller ones, and they're more experimental sizes. They're for small communities. But they will loft this up. There's not a really good political support, and because there's a lot of money that needs to be put in this to develop it, to get it working. Yeah, you had a question?
Just,
Michael.
yes, thank you, Jonathan. We're idealistic. We're good people. We like the idea of wind energy. But, when I fly across the country and I look down on these things, they're butt ugly. And they cover the plains, and they're just horrible to look at on the mountains of New Mexico and Colorado. Plus, they kill birds. If you walk around one of these staffs that holds up these windmills, you'll find thousands of dead birds. That's a fact. So I'm concerned that now we're going to put these things in the ocean. What's the effect on cetaceans? I'm a realist. I don't want to pollute the air, and I want to have dirty water. But we've got to be real about this. We can't have this pie in the sky, as you said, the silver bullet. So let's talk in reality about the consequences of these idealistic choices.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's all part of the puzzle. And I've been part of that conversation and concerned about it. But actually there isn't yet any documented evidence that it's causing a problem for cetacean animals, for fish. But of course, maybe the jury just isn't in on that yet. And certainly when we put larger devices or arrays of devices, right? Because eventually that's where we're all headed, right? That slide I showed you of the Orkney Islands, well, the idea there is that's a testing ground, right? And the government has already leased offshore slots where if a device is successful there in the Orkneys, it can go out and actually be installed permanently. So once we start to do that and put in farms of these, we're going to get into a whole nother territory. And I in the book, I talk with a woman that was involved. There was a device that was set to go into Admiralty Inlet, near where I live. And there was a long study done to find out whether they should do this or not. And I went and spent some time with this woman. And basically she said the evidence with, for example, orca, is that it doesn't bother them. These blades are moving so slow. And they're smart animals. She said that the only foreseeable possible problem, and it's actually happened, was an adolescent male orca was curious enough to stick his nose in one of these blades and got bumped. Didn't get hurt, but got bumped. So she says that, this is a teenager problem. But anyway, I don't mean to be flippant about it. It's an important issue, but I think you also have to weigh the other end of it, which is like, developing oil and our dependency for oil and petroleum products and so forth. So I think there's a need to develop this. There's a need to develop green energy and to shift our dependency away from oil. Yeah.
Palmer has a couple unique things that my daughter suggested that I might remember about tides and the moon. First is that south of town, about 6 miles, is a body of water called Palmer Slough. Goes into an inlet, goes into an arm, into an inlet, and then it goes into the Pacific Ocean. The tidal extreme then is Palmer. That's the furthest north point of the Pacific Ocean.
Well, depending how you count the Bering Sea.
Well, no, that's a sea, and the Chukchi Sea is a sea. You got the ocean bounded by a continent or another sea, or another ocean, right?
Okay.
Palmer's it, the northernmost point of the Pacific Ocean. Okay, that's tidbit one. Tidbit two, it happens to do with the 18.6 years of the lunar cycle.
Mm-hmm.
The last time we had the lunar cycle, which was what, 7 years ago?
I think it was that, yeah.
Somewhere there. I took the family and says, we're going to watch this thing at midnight and see if we're going to see the southernmost part of the moon or the cycle, when you can actually look due north and see the moon. It never sets, just like the Arctic Circle. This is the lunar circle. Right here, latitude 61. We didn't see it. It was cloudy.
Oh, such a good lead up there.
So now we got to wait for, what, it's another 11 years from now? Sign me up. Yeah.
So I had a couple things. So you mentioned that the moon is gradually getting further away over time. That's something I knew about, but I hadn't really thought of. Does that mean that the tides are going to be less extreme, millions of years in the future?
Probably.
Worry about that now. Well, still, it's sad. I feel like big tides.
By then you'll have seen all the tidal pools.
Yeah, well, if I can figure out where the, maximum tides are each location, then, I'm good. The other thing that I kept wishing for as I was reading the book is, and I don't know if this is something you maybe came across at all in your research, is, we have all of this data, all the tide tables calculated for all these various regions. Has anybody made like a visualization of, just how the water moves over the surface of the planet over the course of a day or a month. Something where you can watch, like, maybe color-coded by how much it's dropping or rising, and just kind of see. I was trying to visualize, when I was reading about the amphidromic systems, trying to get my head around that whole thing, like, just what does that look like over time?
Just what your hands did right there. I haven't seen a model of that or a visualization. I think it would be fascinating. It'd be challenging, right? Because there's so many things going on. But I haven't seen one. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, great. Yeah, I'll make my brother program it then.
Yeah, maybe you do a layered thing where you do amphidromic systems, and then you do, high tide, low tide along the coast, and then you start to layer them together. And of course, so you can break them apart as well. Really interesting. Yeah, overlays.
Even something that would just here's, an area of the earth and then color-coded, here's what the water levels are doing, so you can kind of see, like, oh, okay, it's going up and down and all around. That was something that really baffled me when I went from, reading Cook Inlet tide books where, there's the high and the low, and the slightly less high and the slightly less low, but they're still up, down, and then I went to Puget Sound, and I looked in the tide book, and, I was using ProTides, which is one where they show it visually, and I was like, what the heck am I looking at here? Because there's like one real low tide, and then like two little bumps and a dip in between them, and it just was utterly baffling how the water was moving. And then I went out to Vancouver Island, and the tide was just at a totally weird time of day from what I was expecting on the outer coast, and it made more sense when I read about the amphidromic systems. I'm like, okay, so there's kind of this wave sweeping up the coast, but yeah, it's just, it's hard to visualize all of that.
Yeah, and actually, the operative there is just what you said, all of it. Because I found in my own research that it's much easier for me to just take one piece of it and understand what's happening there, and then do it again at another place, and then start to extrapolate, oh, okay, if that's what's happening there, then this is what's happening all over. So I want to leave you with one other really interesting fact about our Pacific here. The Pacific is the largest basin in the world, right, by a long shot, much, much larger than the Atlantic. And by analogy in the film, the Pacific is the garbage can, right? It's the biggest can in there. So it only resonates more than any other can to those really low beats, like the tuba in this case, right? Well, the tuba is the sun, the lowest beat of all of those. And so the Pacific, all basins respond somewhat, at least, to both the sun and the moon, but the Pacific responds more to the sun than any other basin. So that's why we have these crazy mixed tides, right? In part, like what you were just saying, where there's parts of the month or parts of the year where the Pacific is responding more to the sun than it is to the moon. So that's where you have this mixed tide. The Atlantic doesn't have that. It's primarily responding to the moon. So anyway, thank you very much for coming out and all of this conversation. It's the liveliest conversation I think I've had in all of this tour.